Hello, thank you for joining us today for this Subrecipient Management webinar. My name is Sophia Papadimos, and I am a consultant with the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. I've been in the anti-trafficking space for a little bit over a decade. My previous experiences have included being the project director for awards from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the U.S. Department of Justice. So I hope that some of the experiences I bring to this webinar today can be helpful, whether those are lessons that I've learned or things to avoid or things to implement. I'm hoping today is helpful as you start your projects. I really do appreciate you joining us today to learn more about subrecipient management. Partnerships within awards can add tremendous value to the outcome of your project. So let's get started. Coming together is the beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success. While this can be applicable to many things in life, it really resonated with me when thinking about partnerships within the anti-trafficking field. Successful partnerships enhance our response to trafficking. If we can collaborate thoughtfully, if we can work well with our partners, we can better assist survivors of trafficking, and that's ultimately what we're all here to do. So our subrecipient management webinar objectives for today are understanding why subrecipients are important and how to best choose funded partners, learning how to set expectations with subrecipients for ongoing support and resources, and understanding what to consider when effectively monitoring financial, administrative, and programmatic activities of subrecipients. Keeping in mind that the requirements, you may have requirements of your own agency, but also what is outlined in your notice of funding opportunity. There are clear requirements laid out that you will ultimately be held accountable for. And also learning how to adapt the Office on Trafficking in Persons subrecipient monitoring tools for your organization. I can't emphasize this enough. Utilize OTIP as a resource, utilize NITAC. There's a plethora of tools to help recipients monitor and guide their subrecipients. Managing subrecipients can really seem overwhelming at first, especially if you've never had subrecipients or if this is your first award, but I encourage you to lean on OTIP and NITAC when you need assistance. Identifying subrecipients. So how do we know who to partner with? Who can we fit within our project that will enhance our project, and what does that look like? Let's talk about the importance of subrecipients, especially in the anti-trafficking space. Anti-trafficking work cannot occur in a vacuum. It requires collaboration across many disciplines, whether that's behavioral health, social services, community organizations, healthcare, law enforcement, legal aid. Survivors are best served when these agencies work together. So something to think about is, what role does your agency serve when responding to trafficking? Who do you collaborate with regularly? Who would you like to collaborate with if given the chance? These are just some things I want you to keep in mind as you're thinking through who would be a good subrecipient for your project. And what type of collaboration would enhance your agency's response to trafficking? Each funded partner should have expertise, experience, knowledge, capacity, and a geographic reach that enhances the program's ability to achieve overall goals. This is from the Grant Management Toolkit, which I will be speaking a lot about throughout this presentation. And it has so many templates and useful information to help with your award, but I really feel like this one sentence highlights the value add that subrecipients bring to projects. So subrecipients can really provide a different lens and expertise to the project. They provide a different perspective when approaching an issue. They can serve as a liaison to local communities and be a trusted voice within the community. I want you to take a minute to think about your agency and some of the gaps that you may have within your agency, keeping in mind, once again, with that ultimate goal of how can we better assist survivors, whether that's through identification, short-term needs, long-term needs, legal assistance. So how can your organization partner with others to once again better assist those survivors we're trying to reach? So considerations for subrecipients. How to identify potential subrecipients. If you are part of a local anti-trafficking coalition or a task force, that's a great place to start. You can survey members for interest levels. You can also survey members to see what gaps they feel are missing within the community. And you don't always have to partner with another anti-trafficking organization. I think that's really important to emphasize. There may be an agency in your community that focuses on broader issues. For example, a mobile health unit that could provide health services to survivors of trafficking, but probably provides health services to others as well. So when choosing subrecipients, really think about those existing relationships that you already have, which I'm not saying you have to have an existing relationship. You can definitely approach agencies with opportunities to partner, but just thinking about those, I think, as a starting point. And then who plays what role when you're implementing the grant? Once again, these are just items to consider as you're starting your project. When you go into a formal project agreement and process, all of this is going to be clearly laid out for you and your partners. And then the one piece I really want to emphasize too is the programmatic and financial capacity of an agency. It is so important that whoever you are partnering with has that capacity. Accepting awards comes with a lot of responsibilities and requirements, and that isn't to seem or to sound daunting, but that there's a reality that there's going to be accountability levels. And so making sure that who you partner with has that capacity, has that time to, whether that's submitting the reports, whether that's just understanding the financial monitoring, whatever that piece looks like, it's important to make sure your subrecipients agency has that capacity. Setting expectations with subrecipients. It's imperative to set those expectations up front. While subrecipients are partners in the project, as I previously stated, it is your agency that's ultimately going to be accountable for how the dollars are spent and the outcomes of the project. So setting those expectations up front can really alleviate a lot of confusion later in the award if you can point to a period of time or a document and just say, this is how it's been from day one. Managing expectations and keeping an open line of communication is key when working with subrecipients. That open line of communication is so important. You want your subrecipients to be able to come to you when they have questions, as well as you have that open line to go to them with concerns or any other questions that you may have. It really is a two-way street. So formalizing that award partnership, that is step one. So we're going to really go into a lot of detail regarding once you're notified of receiving an award, formalizing a memorandum of understanding, holding a kickoff meeting with subrecipients, set a kickoff meeting with them to go over specific grant details, and that really sets the tone for the grant. If your award is over the course of several years, I think it's still helpful every year to hold that kickoff meeting to kind of go over the objectives for the year. This is an opportunity, we'll go into it in a little bit more detail, but reporting requirements, really everything your subrecipient needs to know up front. And then also have regular scheduled check-ins, right? This just helps with that open line of communication. So whether that's monthly, whether that's weekly, quarterly, however your agency sees it most likely to play out, but having that scheduled time where you can come with an agenda and say, this is what we're going to talk about today. And we'll go over that in a little bit more detail. So formalizing that award partnership. So now that you've identified your subrecipients and they've agreed to sign on, what are the next steps? So like I had mentioned, you're formalizing the partnership through a memorandum of understanding. An MOU should be viewed as a guiding document for the project and protects all parties involved. Per the notice of funding opportunity, the MOU will lay out expectations and requirements for the project, and it can include deliverables, such as the amount of outreach events, the amount of content creation that's expected, or specific data collection. So this document should really be utilized to lay out your entire project, the expectations, the roles, the responsibilities, and that will be helpful throughout the entire award. So before we get into too much of the nitty-gritty details of an MOU, award terms and conditions on subawards, I just wanted to briefly touch on those. The prime recipient is the entity that receives a federal award directly from the Administration for Children and Families. The subrecipient receives a portion of the funding, a subaward from the prime recipient. So the prime recipient is responsible for the oversight of all programmatic, financial, and administrative matters. This includes all the work being created and completed by the subrecipient. So once again, just to emphasize, as the prime recipient, you are accountable for the content that's created, for the objectives that are achieved, as well as the dollars spent. As the prime recipient, you must review and approve all materials and content created by the subrecipient before sending it to AFC for approval. So make sure that whenever your sub sends something that you know you need to have approved at the federal level, you go over it first. Make sure you're reviewing it, you're editing it, and only sending that final version to AFC for approval. The prime recipient must maintain a substantive role in the project. So what is a substantive role? ACF defines a substantive role as conducting activities and providing services funded under the award that are necessary and integral to the completion of the project. That means more than just subrecipient monitoring, but actually contributing to the nuts and bolts of the project. Additionally, the prime recipient must conduct a risk assessment of subrecipients. So the risk assessment. It's necessary to conduct a risk assessment because at the end of the day, the prime recipient, once again, is held accountable for the entirety of the award. In the event the subrecipient is performing unsatisfactorily, the prime recipient is responsible for remedying the issues. It's in every party's best interest to work through any conflicts or compliance issues, because in the event, if you have an award that's a non-competing continuation, subrecipient performance is considered during that review. So just to clarify, if this is your first award, a non-competing continuation is when you have to continue to apply for the award, usually annually, but you're not competing against any other applicants for the dollars. So when you're conducting a risk assessment of your subrecipient, there are some items that can be included, just some helpful tips. So evaluating the subrecipient's prior experience with the same or similar subawards. So how have they conducted their activities? How has their performance been in other awards? Analyze the results of a subrecipient's previous audits and findings. So if there have been previous audits on the specific subrecipient, what was the outcome? What did that look like? Are they a high risk subrecipient? What would that monitoring look like? And we'll talk about monitoring in a little bit. And also consider if the subrecipient has hired any new personnel or has a substantial organizational change. So is there a new director? Are things going to be more clearly laid out? Is the organization in flux? These are all just things to keep in mind when you are doing a risk assessment. And then also, if the subrecipient has received any direct funding from Health and Human Services, consider those monitoring outcomes as well. So basically look at the subrecipient's past in terms of how they have been able to handle grants, what those findings have looked like, what those outcomes are, to really determine their risk as a subrecipient. Now that we have gone through kind of the nitty-gritty definitions and details, I do want to provide a sample memorandum of understanding. This is in the grant management toolkit that I have referenced before, and I will continue to reference because there are so many helpful materials throughout this. This will provide you guidance and examples for specific documents, but once again, this is specific to an MOU and what that might look like. I just want to emphasize again, in your notice of funding opportunity, there will be specific requirements that your memorandum of understanding has to include. So, scope of work. It's very important to define the scope of work within the memoranda of understanding, because this is something you'll constantly be referring to throughout the project. I can't tell you the amount of times I've had to look back at something and been like, but is this proposed activity actually within the scope of work for the award? It may be a great idea, super helpful, but if it's not within the scope of work for which you're being awarded to do, it has to be done under something else. Your performance period. So the dates of the projects, start date, end date, you can put in the sample MOU if there is a possibility of a no-cost extension if your subrecipient needs more time to finish a project. And these are all things that you can kind of work through on the front end. So if your period of performance shifts for any reason, I just want to note the MOU can be amended, right? This is a document that can be amended at a future date if needed. Consideration and payment. It's really important for your subrecipients to understand how they're getting paid up front, what that looks like. We're going to emphasize kind of details of invoices and things later on, but having this spelled out in your MOU, whether that is they're going to be paid monthly, they're going to be reimbursed for dollars, what that looks like can all be spelled out once again up front. I want to emphasize right here cost sharing. So if there's a match requirement to the award, be sure that the subrecipient knows that component up front, and there's a detailed plan to how to achieve that match. Match can be a little bit tricky, and so it's just very important to have those conversations up front. How are you going to have that match? What will that look like? And this will all be formalized in a document. Key personnel, just laying out that who is participating in this project. What does that look like? Changes in key personnel. For example, if you're hiring someone on, that most always has to be approved by your agency as well as by the overseeing federal agency. Talking about travel, always within government rates, mileage, lodging, just making sure that any costs that will be covered and approved are within the allowable funding. Programmatic and financial reporting. So once again, this is an important place to highlight reporting requirements. This section could include specific items that the prime recipient would like to see in the report, such as data collection, any type of metric. You can really use this MOU to guide your project and put in exactly what you would like to see within each report from your subrecipient. Liability and termination. While of course we hope to not have to terminate a subrecipient, it is important to have that language in place in a worst case scenario. If you are ever having issues with the subrecipient or there's cause for concern, you can always speak to your award monitor, but ultimately you know your award best. But it is sometimes helpful to lean on those other resources to understand those who have been in the grant space longer, how they can help you kind of navigate some of those difficult encounters. Because once again, we hope to never have to terminate a subrecipient, but those things can happen, and just making sure you have the terms in place to do that. So here's an actual MOU from a previous OTIP grant. This was for the Look Beneath the Surface Regional Anti-Trafficking Program, which is no longer a program, but I've been given permission to share this MOU in hopes that it's helpful to other prime recipients. So this clearly outlines right here just the purpose of the actual grant and the parties involved. So specifically here, we have the parties who are involved in the MOU, or within the project, I should say, as well as the responsibilities of the subrecipient in the coalition. So this clearly explains the estimated funds for 3 years. I should also note that this MOU is actually executed before the award notification. So this was in preparation. So some of this language is estimated because there hasn't actually been an award issued yet. So that is just a side note when you're reading some of this language, but the responsibilities of the agencies involved. When drafting an MOU, think about how often you would like your subrecipients to submit an invoice. This funding section stipulates no more than monthly for work performed under the MOU. As seen in the previous sample, this MOU also has a clause for termination, which once again, we would hope not to resort to that, but it's important to have that language in there in case that event needs to occur. It's important to note that this MOU was between a government agency, the Ohio Department of Public Safety, and a nonprofit, actually multiple nonprofit agencies. Therefore, some of this language is specific to government requirements and may not be necessary in MOUs between two nonprofits. It's up to your agency's discretion or your agency's legal department's discretion. Once again, as a government agency, our legal department required specific clauses in the MOU. So some sections may be less applicable to agreements between nonprofits only. But once again, your notice of funding opportunity will outline everything that is required within your MOU. Here are the required components of Memoranda of Understanding within your notice of funding opportunity. So that contains specific items of what is required in an MOU. It must clearly describe the roles and responsibilities for project activities and the support or resources that the third party, so whether that's the subrecipient, your contractor, is committing to. The letters of commitment and MOUs must be signed by the person in the third-party organization who has the authority to make those commitments. So it can't be signed by just necessarily a program officer. It most likely is going to need to be signed by their executive director. General letters of support are not considered to be third-party agreements. While they can be helpful for collaboration boards or things like that, an MOU is what's required, not a general letter of support. So just highlighting again, key components that will be helpful. Purpose of the project, really outlining what are we here to do. And hopefully what I've shown you so far, that you can adapt that based on the samples provided. And these topics, I guess, in my experience, have been the most important pieces of an MOU. So the purpose of the project, parties' responsibilities. So whether that's data collection, project outcomes, the amount of funding. This may change each year depending on the project. So having that explained in your MOU, the frequency of invoicing. How often will your agency be invoicing OTIP? This may help guide how frequently you would like your subrecipients to invoice. And then any requirements, code of conduct, or laws each party needs to abide by. And then a process, like I had mentioned, for termination, which we of course hope not to have to go that route, but in the event you do, making sure the groundwork is in place for what needs to happen next. So this is just a sample if you were going to include a job description. So for example, if the program is requiring hiring personnel, including the job description with the MOU allows all parties to agree to job qualifications and responsibilities. You may also want to include language about a joint interviewing process for the position, or as the prime recipient, you must sign off on the proposed candidate, which then will also have to be signed off by your federal agency as well. So hopefully that gave you a good idea of what can be included in an MOU. And once again, at the end of the presentation, you'll have access to that grant management toolkit where you can pull that sample up directly. The MOU is such an important piece of starting your partnership that it is important to have everything kind of laid out ahead of time so that you can start the project on your best foot. So the award kickoff meeting. This is an opportunity as the prime recipient to really set the tone for the project. This is a great opportunity to set the expectations and have all partners on the same page from day one. Prior to the meeting, ask subrecipients to come prepared. Send the full award application that your agency submitted ahead of time so that everyone has an opportunity to read it before the meeting. It helps subrecipients see their role, but in a larger picture, and what exactly this project is going to achieve on a greater level. At the meeting, provide subrecipients with binders. So I'm a paper person. I understand if you are not, you may just do this in electronic form, but that binder can include all relevant award materials. So the application, reporting forms, your budget narrative. And when creating this binder, it's a great time, once again, to reference that grant management toolkit that's available, because there are helpful resources. You can reference onboarding materials from that toolkit. Just can't say enough positive things about it. During your meeting, I think it's important to identify a point person at the subrecipient's agency to be the primary contact for the project. So sometimes if you're working, your own agency may have 5 people working on this grant. The subrecipient agency may have 3 people working on this grant. It's very important to have one point of contact at the subrecipient agency so the communication can really be streamlined. And also, I think consistent messaging is a great outcome when you have that one point person. If your award is strictly per capita, I think still all of this information is helpful and applicable, just laying out all the terms of the award up front. However, I would also take the time to go over specifically what activities with clients can be charged to the project, include information such as how does your subrecipient track time spent with a client, or working on an eligibility letter or certification letter. So whether that's in 6-minute increments or 15-minute increments, really make sure that they understand how they can bill for the grant. So the duration and then the description of the work being done. So within the award kickoff meeting, it's also very important, the budget, to review the budget. So when going through this binder you provided or on the computer, allow ample time to review the budgets. Budgets can be overwhelming, especially if the subrecipient is an agency without a fiscal department. So if you have a subaward with someone who maybe has a smaller agency, sometimes the financial piece can seem overwhelming. But this is a great opportunity, once again, to provide information up front and just continue to explain to your subrecipients that you're here to help and have them work through any budget questions. It's really important to highlight what's allowable in the grant, but almost more importantly, what is not allowed. For example, the grant may say, or the award may say, funds cannot go to certain equipment or food. It's best for subrecipients to understand this up front, kind of avoid any problems later down the line. Now, having said that, it's normal for plans to change or unanticipated costs to come up. So just be sure subrecipients know the process for a budget adjustment. Does your own agency have a specific process? And if so, it might just be easiest to default to what your process is. But how does that budget adjustment work? And honestly, the first time a subrecipient has to conduct a budget adjustment, it may be helpful to have you on the phone and do it with them, just for that first time to kind of walk them through the steps. Also explain the process for reimbursement. If a subrecipient won't receive their payment for 4 to 6 weeks after an invoice, share that information ahead of time, because that also may cause a subrecipient to want to invoice monthly, especially if they're maybe a smaller organization that doesn't have that money to front ahead of time. Once again, this is just explaining processes up front, and it really can prevent a lot of headaches and frustration in the future. So while subrecipients can incredibly add to a project, they also come with responsibilities. That's just the reality of being a managing agency on a project. And monitoring programmatic and financial activities is important, but it doesn't always have to be as scary as it initially seems. Project oversight. There are 3 main areas of project oversight. This includes the financial management and monitoring, so tracking expenditures, budget and budget narrative, invoices, documentation, financial reports and audits, as well as administrative duties. So confirming eligibility, tracking personnel, reviewing processes, identifying gaps, and your programmatic activities. So allowable program activities, programmatic reporting, site visits for programmatic findings. This is kind of how we can break down what your auditing will look like. So proposed budget items to consider. One of the most important things is to thoroughly understand the subrecipient's budget. From the grant kickoff meeting, ensure the budget items are allowable, logical, and reflect the grant program. It's very important that the budget narrative justifies budget line items. The budget will ultimately have to be approved by OTIP, but once again, you know your project better than anyone. So if something doesn't seem like it aligns with the project, don't hesitate to make those adjustments. If you have concerns, call your monitor at OTIP. Say you have some concerns about what's in your budget. So really just making sure that things are allowable. Is this budget enough to implement programming? Is the budget narrative justifying the line items? And really reflect the requirements of the grant program. Here's just a sample budget worksheet. This is once again from the Grant Management Toolkit. It breaks down different categories of the budget. I can't emphasize this enough. The toolkit is your friend. There are a lot of pages in it. You can open it up and think, wow, this is a lot, but it is helpful information that will really guide your project. Please take the time to read it through and then just tab anything that's relevant to your specific project. So some common line items in this sample budget worksheet. We have personnel, fringe benefits, travel, contractual work. So sometimes if you have a contract for your subrecipient. So once again, this is just meant to be a template to see kind of what are some of the categories that are included in budgets. Responsible financial management practices ensure that grant activities and objectives are implemented within the approved budget and project period. And I just really think that that's very important when we're discussing subrecipient management. The financial piece is key. And so really making sure you understand your budget worksheet, you understand your subs worksheets very thoroughly. So this is actually a sample budget worksheet from a grant I worked on. So it was a Subrecipient was a human trafficking coalition. So what we had here in our Subrecipients budget was the positions, wages, their fringe, the office supplies that they were allowed per month, cell phone service, outreach and training events, dollars toward occupancy, so their rent, utilities, telephone, internet, local travel, and then printing costs for public awareness materials, and then we allowed indirect costs as well. So this is 1 year for a Subrecipient's budget. And once again, this was just done in a Word document, creating a chart. So I think sometimes when you think about budgets, you think of very fancy financial software, and you don't necessarily need that to have a very straightforward, logical budget worksheet. So how to track expenditures. This can also just be done with something as simple as an Excel document. An expenditures tracking sheet will include the project budget broken down by category, and then a row of actual expenses for that particular month. Expenses to date, and then remaining funds available. So you can have a tab for the percentage of funds remaining. It's also not uncommon to spend more in the beginning of a project. So for example, sometimes if there's a lot of startup equipment involved, you may burn through more money up front, which is not a problem. That is to be expected in certain projects. But really just making sure that you are tracking what you are spending and that you are on track to spend what you are being given, right? Because we can't go over the award amount. You most likely are not going to be getting any more dollars than what was allotted to you. So just making sure you're keeping track of that from the start of your spending. So here's a sample expenditure tracking report. So for example, we have salaries and for the categories, salaries and wages, fringe benefits, travel, supplies, equipment, contractual, and subawards, and then any other direct costs. So that first line is everything that's been approved within the budget. Then we have what's previously been reported, your current invoice amount, and then your cumulative expenses. So it's just clearly laid out what is your remaining budget balance and what that looks like. And this can just help you set up for your year. So whether that is, you have more dollars for certain activities, you have more dollars toward serving more clients, whatever that may be, you just have a good handle on it. Here's another sample expenditure tracking report from, once again, your best friend, the Grant Management Toolkit. This report allows you to stay on track at any point and just know if your program is under or overspent and where you need to adjust accordingly. So this can, once again, be just created in an Excel workbook. And this can help you keep track. You can do it monthly, however you are spending dollars, whether that's on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, whatever you feel is best to update. But this just allows you to have a handle on that grant budget. So subrecipient financial checklist. When subrecipients submit a financial report, this can be a helpful checklist to ensure the appropriate information is submitted. So these are all items that, once again, can be included in that grant kickoff meeting. So is there a detailed invoice? Did the work or activities occur during the reporting period? Make sure the costs are allowable. And finally, is there supporting documentation included? It's up to your agency how much supporting documentation needs to be submitted with each report that your subrecipient submits to you, but it is important for subrecipients to know exactly what documentation will be necessary, whether they're submitting that monthly, and then also when you go to do a site visit. For example, subrecipients are having some difficulties. They may be required to submit more documentation until there's a consistent pattern of understanding. So I have worked on other grants in the past in which I was the subrecipient, and I needed to submit receipts every month with my report. And then once we kind of had a handle on what exactly was required as documentation, those weren't required every month. I needed to always have them on hand, though, and make sure your subrecipients understand that any of these items that are charged to the award can be asked for at any time. So making sure that they have a very good record-keeping system. All financial requirements should be explained at that kickoff meeting. And you may have to continue to remind people, but once again, just laying out those requirements from the onset of the grant. And I've mentioned this before, but if the agency has the capacity, monthly subrecipient reporting can be helpful in the beginning, and then you can move to quarterly reporting once the subrecipient is more comfortable with the reporting process. But just ensure that there is adequate time from when your subrecipient submits their final financial report to you to when it is actually due to your funding agency. So I would send a reminder out to subrecipients 2 weeks before their financial report is due, and then give yourself, upon receipt of that report, another 2 weeks before you have to submit. So for example, if you need to submit by April 30th, make sure your subrecipients have their information to you by April 15th to give you enough time to get your report in order for your federal funding agency. Recipient invoicing. So I previously have mentioned detailed invoices. This is really what an invoice should include: reporting period, date of work, amount of time worked, and a thorough description of work, as well as the signature of your subrecipient. So as the primary recipient, you can provide a template invoice or ask subrecipients to make adjustments if the invoice isn't detailed enough. Once again, it's important to go over this during the grant kickoff meeting, and it may be helpful for you to work with your award monitor to say, what is an appropriate template to give my subrecipient for invoicing? So then it can capture the information needed. This is a made-up sample invoice that I thought would be helpful to show kind of what the budget item is, the quantity of hours, the description of work. And I just want to emphasize here really the description, right? It's very clear what was completed during the time build. For example, 3 hours of edit isn't sufficient, right? You need to explain what you worked on. So develop the curriculum for grades 9 through 12. Updated 6 through 8 curriculum to include more information about human trafficking skills and building activities. And if it's an administrative item, met with OTIP and NITAC for kickoff call. So just clearly laying out what you've done. There should never be an instance in which, as the prime recipient, you receive a sample invoice that says work completed. So just make sure that those details are explained up front of what you would like to see in the invoices provided. Examples of supporting documentation. So receipts, of course, if anything was purchased, timesheets and payroll. And we'll go into this a little bit more, but supporting documentation is crucial to financial monitoring. Subrecipients must keep a record of all expenses incurred during the project period. So once again, this includes receipts for mileage, equipment, supplies, timesheets with descriptions of award-related work, the payroll, including fringe. As previously mentioned, these items don't necessarily need to be submitted each month or quarter, but subrecipients should have them on file in the event it's requested by you as the prime recipient or your funding agency. Administrative oversight. Meticulous record keeping is critical when implementing an award. The binder, now I will refer to this binder quite frequently because I have found them to be so helpful, but binder or electronic file is an excellent way to stay organized. So it's important to keep track of correspondence, especially any requests that have been approved or denied, and any items relating to the budget. So for example, if your subrecipient requests something, whether it's cost for printing or translation or whatever that may be, and you say yes, just making sure we're keeping track of all of those emails in which an important decision has been made. Once again, if you're not a paper person, this can all be saved electronically. But circling back to that grant management toolkit, there are excellent administrative onboarding questions for the project. So our compliance documents in place, right? At the beginning of your award, there are going to be certain compliance documents that you have to submit. Are staff appropriately trained? This is particularly an important one because certain trainings may be necessary to get all partners on the same page. For example, when we were talking about how to best choose a subrecipient, if you're bringing in someone who has a specific niche, for example, like healthcare, that healthcare mobile unit I referenced earlier, but they may not have as much knowledge about human trafficking. Human trafficking training may be necessary for that person. So they're starting with a baseline understanding of this specific topic. And then our personnel background checks in place, for example, what does that look like if you're onboarding staff? What does that requirement look like? And then once again, the reporting requirements for subrecipients. So really that administrative oversight is best done just when you have meticulous records and you can stay organized. So back to our handy dandy friend, the grant management toolkit. This is a subrecipient monitoring and documentation checklist and agenda. So financial oversight is very important, and we have covered a lot of those reporting requirements. As the prime recipient, though, your agency should also conduct a site visit to your subrecipients. This is an opportunity for your agency to observe how the subrecipient is operating. It can be helpful to send the list ahead of time, though, of the specific documentation you may be looking for. So whether that's programmatic or financial, but to kind of send a checklist ahead of time, whether that's 2 weeks before your visit, but just to make sure your subrecipient can get everything that they need in order. And this site visit should really be viewed as an opportunity for growth. I know I have been guilty in the past of being so afraid of a site visit and just getting very nervous, even when, all the dollars have been spent appropriately and there are no issues. I think just the term site visit or audit can have this frightening connotation. But really, it should be viewed as an opportunity for growth and not an opportunity for punishment, right? Everyone in this project wants the project to be successful. And so this is an opportunity to see where we can be doing better, where we have had gaps. And of course, if there are improper findings, how we address that. I wanted to talk about these regularly scheduled check-ins with subrecipients that I had referenced earlier, trying to kind of stay on track with the award. So whether these are weekly or monthly, regularly scheduled check-ins are really essential when implementing objectives and maintaining these successful partnerships. So if your project has multiple subrecipients, this is a great opportunity for all people involved on the project to connect. However, you know your program best. So if you think individual meetings with just in particular subrecipients is more helpful, you can also go that route as well. So this is a great opportunity to talk about what are the planned activities for the week or month. What is the anticipated work? So whether that's training, outreach activities, curriculum development, how are upcoming activities meeting the objectives of the grant? Is the subrecipient on track to meet set goals? For example, if chapters 2 and 5 were supposed to be developed by a certain date, is that still the case? Are we still on track to hit those targets? As the prime recipient, how can you assist your subrecipients? Sometimes it's just that simple, saying, how can I help you? How can I, make this easier for you in some ways if they're struggling? So really just a conversation around workload and what is planned for that upcoming month, week, however often you check in. Success stories. This is always a highlight of the conversation. Allow time for subrecipients to share things that worked well within their program. Did a subrecipient have a training that went particularly well? Was it due to a specific topic, a specific speaker? If there are multiple subrecipients on the project, this is a great opportunity to ask one another for advice. So how were you able to get, this certain agency to your meeting? And just be able to share kind of some of the wins. Because when you're working on these awards, when you're working in a space as heavy as the anti-trafficking field can be, don't gloss over this. Your success story should be shared. Small wins sometimes can actually be really big wins, and just really appreciating the work that's being completed on your project. And of course, with success, we also have obstacles. So this is really an opportunity to allow your subrecipients to also share their challenges and provide feedback as the prime recipient. It may be that the subrecipient needs more guidance from your agency. Not all problems are necessarily going to be solved in this 30-minute or 1-hour check-in, but it allows them to be put on the radar so you are aware. While these meetings may help avoid the oh no moments within your project, and those may happen some point in the grant, which is okay and normal. Just having this regular check-in can really ease some of that throughout the project. And the more information you have from your subrecipients about issues that come up, the more likely you can help solve those problems. It's instead of being blindsided by them, right? There's nothing worse than not knowing about an issue and it catching you at the exact wrong time. For example, a site visit. So really trying to work those out as they come up. Budget items. Maybe the not as exciting topic of conversation, but very important nonetheless. This is a great time to get a handle on what funds have been spent and what is anticipated for the next month or quarter, once again, however frequently you're meeting. And similar to project obstacles, this helps avoid an invoice for a large amount of money that's either over budget or something you didn't know was occurring. Once again, this is where your expenditure tracking is super helpful and important. so that you're not receiving an invoice after a month or 3 months that is an exorbitant amount of money and you just have no idea what it was for. And you thought that was something that was happening in month 6 during the project. So you can always ask your subrecipients to come prepared to that. And once again, I really encourage agendas for these check-ins. If you just have, here's what we're going to talk about. And I would send those maybe out even just like a week before your meeting to try and put it as a reminder for folks, but also give them time to prepare. So let's talk about programmatic activities, which are obviously going to come up in your check-ins, but sometimes the meat of your award. Programmatic activities should be tied to grant objectives. Many activities are typically outlined in the application your agency has already submitted. And it's really important to remember that all materials, trainings, curricula need to be approved by you as the prime recipient and HHS. And while there has been a great emphasis on financial monitoring, documentation for programmatic activities is as equally important. So this can include sign-in sheets, meeting agendas, meeting minutes, anything that supports what your program has been doing, maybe training evaluations or just the creation of the evaluation itself for your trainings. But program activities, and I just want to emphasize one more time, should be tied to the award objectives. So an important, when we're doing these programmatic activities, an important element is their outcome, right? How has this activity shaped our project? How have we bettered our goals? The grant management toolkit has an excellent sample of how to measure outcomes. So this can be outlined by breaking down the goals of the award and then deciding what the desired short-term outcome and long-term outcomes and how to best measure those. So this example provides, this is for the SOAR to Health and Wellness goal, right? So to build capacity of communities to identify and respond to the complex needs of victims and survivors of human trafficking, and to respond to the root causes that make individuals, families, and communities at risk. So what is the short-term outcome? Increasing skills and knowledge and identifying all types of victims of trafficking. And so how do we measure that? Immediate survey feedback, post-training participation, and then examples of how you could kind of phrase those in an evaluation. So this is just very helpful to look at how can we measure our short-term and long-term outcomes. So I encourage you once again to make the grant management toolkit your best friend throughout your award period. Subrecipients enhance programs. It cannot be said enough. Effective partnerships and collaboration allow projects to thrive. Have open lines of communication with your subs and your grant monitor. This creates honest discussions and can often solve problems or misunderstandings before they get too far down the line. Subrecipient management comes with great responsibilities, but also great impact. When we work with our subrecipients, we are improving our response to trafficking. When we can work with more partners in this space, we are providing a more holistic response to trafficking. And so while subrecipient management can seem like a lot of work at time, and there are a lot of requirements, it's important to keep in mind, as a whole, we are better assisting survivors through our partnerships. So I wanted to just share a few of the resources out there. Once again, the grant management toolkit, which I know I referenced a lot throughout the presentation. There's also some documents from the Office of Justice Programs, Territories Financial Support Center, Subaward Guide Sheet, and OJP's entities oversight responsibilities for subrecipient materials. These are all helpful documents when you are a prime recipient to help you guide your work with your subrecipient. There's just so many resources out there that are helpful when navigating your role. So once again, this just includes some of the most relevant ones. And don't hesitate to utilize NITAC as a resource either. Their staff is filled with technical knowledge. So if you do have questions, please do reach out to NITAC. Here's the information. And thank you all so much for your time today.